Have you ever wondered if the healing practices from the world's oldest continuing culture have anything in common with ancient mind-body practices like yoga? Have you felt a deep reverence for the land and elements of nature, curious about its custodians generations before your arrival? My guest today is Jaqui Jarrett. She's working to elevate First Nations people in the domain of yoga, focusing on the interrelationship between First Nations practices and yoga philosophy. She is the founder of Nura Yoga, guiding yoga, meditation, and walks on her country as a traditional owner. Join me as we talk to Jacqui and she shares the wisdom of her journey. Welcome, Jacqui. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to start with you telling us a little bit about yourself.
I want to first of all say thank you for having me here, Danielle, and I feel absolutely privileged to be here. And just giving everybody a little bit of a context around, I did my teacher training with the Yoga Impact charity, and as a First Nations woman, it's always lovely to reconnect, and so I like the fact that we're reconnecting. And for those who don't know me, my name is Jaqui Jarrett. I'm a proud Dawel and Gambangu woman. To put into a little bit of context is I refer to my mother's lineage and being a descendant, a Dawel descendant. And I also refer to my father's lineage, which is Gambangu and the mid-north coast. But to understand, we're here today on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is in Sydney, Pyrmont, and to share with you that I have multiple kingship links within what is known as the Sydney Basin, without getting too involved in it, but I have many, many kingship links around the Sydney Basin, and I refer to myself as a Sydney coastal woman. And I'm a descendant of the country that we're on here today. So it's just an honour to be here and to talk to you today, Danielle, about my yoga journey. And of course, with that comes who I am as a First Nations woman and country.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. And I'm interested, what attracted you to yoga in the very beginning?
Very much around seeing people sitting in stillness, sitting in quietness, very much resonating with how I would connect to country, how I sit on country. And so it was through that, being drawn to those similarities, and for me to build on my already existing ways of being connected, feeling grounded, having a sense of belonging, and knowing that it was a self-care practice, a self-inquiring practice, really drew me in. Then if I could talk more specifically about your yoga teaching course with the Yoga Impact charity, once I started getting drawn into this practice of deepening my connection, knowing I had a really solid grounding being a First Nations woman, having all my cultural, spiritual practices have kept me strong in identity, my sense of belonging. I also needed a little bit more. I understood that. I'm living in a Western world, very busy world, a very conflicting world at times. And how do I manage such a way of living, I guess? And so starting with my solid grounding, but then so also looking at how the Western world has affected me mentally as well. And so that comes to when I wanted to, of course, I was interested in yoga and I began to have that practice of yoga and I thoroughly enjoyed that. I also knew that it was a practice that I wanted to share, coming from a culture of sharing, right? This practice isn't just for me to have alone. It can never be that as a First Nations woman. And so again, I think, okay, well, why don't I become a yoga teacher? And so then my journey from there was, just researching, having a look. But at the time also, as I said, trying to navigate my world, my two worlds, felt really solid as a First Nations woman, had my cultural, spiritual practices, had my really strong sense of identity, had a really strong presence of belonging within community. But when I stepped outside of that, I felt different. And I knew I had to act different as well. But in saying that, I wanted to have a balance. I needed a balance. And so yoga became what I believe, giving me the ability to balance out those two worlds a little bit more. I love the fact that yoga is an ancient practice too. And as a dark-skinned woman, I'm happy to say it comes from a dark-skinned culture. And so again, that was a draw card as well. The fact that the way we live at our lives as First Nations people, and I want to highlight that this has been happening for 65,000 years, the fact that we've understood we're connected and that there's an interconnectedness. We've always understood that. And I believe that I strongly believe that we're the leaders in that, in the world, First Nations people. We upheld those practices for 65,000 years. And so I'm incredibly proud of that. So there's also, as I was saying, the Yoga Impact Charity talked about a teacher's course that included trauma-informed yoga. All the other yoga courses, teacher courses, I wasn't resonating with. And that's no disrespect to yoga itself, the philosophy of yoga and the roots of origin of yoga, and respectfully acknowledging the gift that they have given to the world. But I live in Australia and it can present very strongly in a westernized way. And so when I was Googling, I wasn't always seeing what reflected in me. But again, going back to when I saw trauma-informed yoga, I thought, here's my balance of when I step outside of who I am, beyond my community, which is my safe container, my place of belonging within my family, things get a little bit unbalanced. And at the time, I'm very honest to say, I've had, like most people, I've had some mental health issues. That's depression, anxiety. Trauma has been an incredible impact on First Nations people historically. So those things started to resonate really strongly with me. So, and I want to say that my journey with yoga, practicing yoga and teaching yoga, is going to be a lifetime journey, but one that just aligns beautifully with who I am as a First Nations woman. So I speak to you as a First Nations woman and a First Nations yogi who absolutely adores this practice of yoga. So, and as I said, it's about kindness. It's about, acceptance. All of those things that really are inside of everyone. And I feel as though I have quite a bit of that inside of me. each and every day, and about putting out care into the world. And my communities do that so well. Like, we come together, we show up in our communities in, we have cultural humility. So we show up and we care. So just to keep it kind of like, I feel as though I'm living that life as a First Nations woman, and then following the philosophies and the disciplines and the practices of the 8 limbs of yoga.
You mentioned trauma-informed yoga, and I'm going to ask you a little more about that a little bit later. But something I'm curious about before we head in that direction is, you've mentioned you are from the longest continuing living culture on earth. Yeah. And I'm curious about what gifts are you carrying with you today from people who've come before you?
To know that we are simply enough as we are, that we will always be able to connect to country, to our culture, to our identity. We just ensure that we, as you're saying, continue is the key word here, that we understand that we continue to maintain our cultural, spiritual practices, and also, because we're in a modern world today, how do we adjust to this modern world? But to never lose sight of, we orally pass down our knowledges, practices and wisdoms continuously. So we see it as a cultural and spiritual responsibility, right? And as you're saying, a gift. It keeps us continuously connected to who we are, our practices and our ways of life. And I feel as though it's just the importance of passing down orally, speaking, also doing. So we can practice our dance, we have our art, we have it all, and it's still there and it's still present. I don't feel as though it's changed that much. I mean, I feel as though it's becoming more accepting in the modern world of our presence. But it's just about our knowledges, sharing our Dreamtime stories, our on-country stories. It's about dance. It's about knowing that we are a continuation of life through things where we're granted what our totem is. So again, as you're talking about this continuation, we understand, I'm sitting here with you, Danielle, in what we would call a 3-dimensional world, in a sense, a physical sense. But I know after here, I continue in my cultural, spiritual wisdom of knowing that I will become a whale. I'm a saltwater descendant. So I understand, I had this interesting conversation with another First Nations lady, how in the West, death is seen as a final end to who you are and how you exist. That's not the case with us. And if you could tie that back into, do not see this in the physical sense. So we understand our creation and our continuation never ends, because it's not just about my physical presence. So when this physical presence ends and changes is probably the word I'd like to use. And for it to be seen in a spiritual sense is that I will then become a whale. Now, my whales, as a totem, I then become a whale, and we have whale stories that I share in our Daryl language, our Daryl ways of being. I'm a saltwater woman. So we just have this, if you could look at it in terms of it's a continuation of life. We don't see anything ending in the physical sense. And rather than trying to go into, other than explaining, we have stories, Dreamtime stories. We have our cultural dances. We have our cultural practices. We connect to country. We stand in bare feet in water. But I guess to try and get people who are not First Nations people to understand is, please don't look at me as this physical entity and that is it. Because I will, while I'm in this physical sense, I will share my wisdom and knowledge. I will pass it down to my family, my children, my grandchildren, and that knowledge just continues. But there's also spiritual elements to it. My children, my grandchildren, my community know that I am not just merely a physical being, that my next journey, I'll migrate and become a whale, but that I'm still there. So I hope that, in a sense, is making people who are not Indigenous understand, and not to draw on modern concepts about our culture is not here. Our culture is a living, breathing thing that will always exist. And people may find that a difficult thing to understand, but I hope by sharing, I'm here, but my next journey I'll be a whale. And then after that, so there's this continuous cycles. So, yeah, infinity, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does, Jacqui. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective.
And that in itself is a gift about also we belong, we don't own. And belonging gives you that spiritual expansion of you can belong in so many forms. So I'm hoping, and this interview is going to capture some small captures and snapshots of, I wouldn't say complex, but very in-depth. And if people were to think about it in time alone, 65,000 years, but then to understand, as First Nations people, we know there's that continuation. There's no finality, there's no final, there's no end.
You've mentioned these gifts that you're carrying with you and the importance of sharing that with your children, with your grandchildren, but I know that you're also sharing them in a variety of communities. Could you talk to me a little bit more about some of the ways that you're sharing First Nations knowledge, but also the yoga philosophy in community?
First of all, we start, when it's within my community, we always draw on our strengths of knowing ourselves as First Nations people, putting into perspective where we come from first, grounding ourselves, connecting ourselves with country, sharing our stories. And then from there, we bring this subtle little shift in. Yoga philosophy is this philosophy, but we also, and this is where I just want to make a clear distinction. I do like to make a distinction, a respectful distinction. We have our First Nations, I have my First Nations cultural, spiritual practices, and then we have yoga and the philosophies and the roots of yoga. Now, they are separate. They are not the same. I, as a First Nations yogi, see a lovely alignment with it, but I will always say they're very separate, they're very distinct, and they both deserve their own respectful place in the world. And so coming from, when we come together, it's collaborations, it's partnerships. When we talk about, and particularly relationships, First Nations people are relationship people. And we use the word connection a lot when we talk about relationships. So when I come to do yoga in my community, first and foremost, I'm known as the woman I am in the community, just like the woman who's going to do the class with us. There's no, I'm me in the sense of, I like to use it that I'm guiding. And as I said, it's just about an evolution of growing and sharing my relationship with my community. I can show up as an auntie. I can show up as I'm known as a mum and a nan in my community. I know I'm a member of the local Redfern All Blacks football community. My tribal warrior corporation know me. So I show up in that sense, and I think with that relationship comes a reciprocal respect that I can then show up and be, in a sense, a yoga teacher and teach the skills that I've learnt and impart them on to other members of the community. So that's how I show up. And then we try to do it in a way where, as I was saying, there's respect, there's honouring of everybody. And again, what I love about yoga is giving choice. So, and also just encouraging community to be curious, be open to the possibilities of trying, but first of all, grounding it in our cultural ways of being and just sharing with them that it's very, very similar. And so I also say that you may find that once you sit quietly and we go into a meditation, you feel really quite connected and it feels familiar because it is essentially about you connecting to country. And then when they do those things, we kind of go, oh, yeah. So again, it's about just building on my already existing and First Nations people's cultural, spiritual practices. And then I do like to bring in, because we've talked about trauma-informed. We as a community know how to hold space. We know how to hold humility. We know how to care. We know how to be respectful. We know how to navigate in a way that everyone's feeling okay. And that okay could be, I might opt out. I may just watch. And so it's that. So it's about just showing up. And we talked about this just before we came in, Danielle, if you don't mind me saying this. Sometimes it's about the conversation itself, the relationship itself, and not so much about we're going to have a particular outcome. Because I think also when I introduce something that is not something of our understanding, we may have a little bit of hesitation. We may have a little bit of fear. This is something we haven't done. It's not a part of our culture. I'm a little apprehensive. And so just opening it up to being more curious and learning from that. So just starting off, and I feel as though, although I'm showing up a lot in community and it's happening beautifully, I mean, I've been working with a lot in Deadly Connections. I want to mention these beautiful organisations too. Deadly Connections, which is a women's organisation led by beautiful women, guided by beautiful women, upheld by beautiful women. The Tribal Warrior legal aid, Walama, court listing people. Also, I mentioned Tribal Warrior, didn't I? And also the Redfern All Blacks women's rugby league team. I've done things for them. But also just about conversations at times too, Danielle, about the conversations and just opening up the space about what yoga could be is very, very important as well to build that trust. So I hope that explains it in a sense. And as I said, just really grounding us in ourselves first and foremost. And that could be just arriving on the mat and honouring ourselves as First Nations people first and foremost.
I can imagine that as a space holder, as a teacher, as a mum, as a nan, all of the different hats that you're wearing, that process involves a lot of deep listening and understanding what it is people need and are able to be curious with. How do you navigate that?
Yeah. Well, as I'm saying, yoga is not necessarily something that we take on. Being aware of who they are at that moment, trying to get them to accept themselves in that moment. We talk a lot about in our communities around cultural safety, being culturally responsive, having cultural humility. So understanding at times, just introducing a different concept, how's that going to show up and feel? So we want to make sure we've got an environment. We understand physical safety. We don't ensure that will be the case, but we always say we're here with humility. There's no right or wrong ways of doing things, and we hold and nurture ourselves as a community, as a collective, on the floor, whether we're sitting on mats. So just knowing that there's that connectiveness, there's that support from me, from others in the class, and we let go of that, as we call in yoga, non-harming, like again, letting go of that needing to do it right, needing to be perfect. Do we need to look at another person and say, I need to do it like that? So having those kind of discussions, because the West shapes you in a way where you are competing, where you are striving for perfection. And so just unpacking those layers of how we can show up as First Nations people doing a practice of yoga in a way that feels right for us.
Jacqui, can you talk to me about when you are in community and you are sharing these practices, what are some of the most impactful yoga practices that you've witnessed so far?
All of them. We go with purpose, we go with intention. We're not attaching ourselves to an outcome, but we're showing up caring. We're showing up to have an impact in that we're hoping, at the very least, while we're holding space, they're understanding that they're being accepted for who they are. Inviting again curiosity and openness, and just being together is impactful. We understand that as First Nations people, being together, holding space, allowing ourselves to be who we are in that moment, but also as a collective. So to me, I couldn't say that I have a particular favorite, or that I have one that I find is more impactful than another. Because as I was saying, our common ways of being and doing are we show up with humility, we show up with care, we show up with support, and we hold space in a good way, so that while we're there, we're feeling good. When we arrive, we're feeling good. And when we leave, we're feeling good. Not to say that we don't have an uncertainty that comes with us when we arrive, or that when we're going through our practice, other things may come up. But knowing that you have other people there to help you and support you through that is impactful, if that makes sense. So I just feel as though as long as we can do that, that's being impactful. Keeping our connections strong, reconnecting with our culture, and holding up space for each other. Although, as I was saying, it may bring up an unpleasant feeling. It may bring up, I'm feeling awkward in this pose. But knowing that that's okay too. Just really about let's accept ourselves. Because, as I said, letting go of those, Western ideologies about perfection, or you have to look a certain way. I've had discussions where I've had young women come to me and go, "Oh, Auntie, but I don't have any tights." And we go, "That's okay." So there's also a lot of work that I do in unpacking. We don't need tights. We don't need a yoga mat. We don't need perfection in poses. So a lot of yarning, community conversations. Yeah. And as I said, different perspectives as well. So, but holding ourselves in the support of, we want to find out more. We understand it might not be everything where we want it to be at the time, but just doing things collectively in a supportive environment is really, really good.
And Jacqui, can you talk to me about why a trauma-informed approach is important when you are working with your community?
I'm glad you've asked that question, because we had, as a people, historically been traumatised, displaced. So we know as a collective, when we come together, we want to make sure that, again, we're talking about feeling safe. So I think with our communities, a way that we bring about trauma-informed principles and practices is about making sure we have cultural safety. We've talked about that we're culturally responsive. So if someone's feeling a little bit awkward in being on a yoga mat, and go, we're right. I'm here with your mob, and we just try and make everyone feel comfortable, safe, and again, just going back to grounding in our solid identity. But it's very, very important because, as we know, without getting too much into it, historically, the impact of was very traumatic. And there's many, many traumas that we experience. And we're very, very aware as a First Nations people about the many ways that we have been traumatised. There's racial trauma, there's displacement. So understanding that we as First Nations people have experienced that, but we also know how we can hold space for ourselves. And again, using those terms about being culturally safe. Being culturally safe means we have a First Nations women's yoga group, right? So that makes us feel safe in our identity, knowing who we are in our community. So that alleviates and takes away, some of the experiences of feeling ashamed if you're with somebody else who's not in your community comes along and you don't know them. You may think that they're going to place judgment on you because there's so many layers that we've experienced. It's not just about trauma, it's about judgments, it's about mistruths. So we understand we can alleviate all of those impactful negative impacts of who we are. So being together as a collective gives us strength, to actually manage that.
And I know you've been witness to a lot of resilience in your own life and also in the communities that you work in.
Yes.
I wondered if you could talk to me a little bit about that and a little bit about the ways that your First Nations practices, and maybe in conjunction with some of the yoga philosophy, about how that has supported the resilience.
Sure. Look, resilience is, I guess, the fact that we're still here, right? Again, I'm not quite sure how I could actually shape that in the sense of non-Indigenous people understanding that. But for us, it's been over 200 years. Not quite sure the exact, but the fact that we've continued to show up, not to show up, that continue to be here, experience the things that we have experienced, but still have kindness, care, not only within our families and our communities. We show that to the wider world. I just feel as though we are just a caring race of people, and we care about humanity. We care about impacts around displacement. And I guess in a way that builds our resilience through caring, through being concerned, through knowing that we still are going to be here and how we want to be here, shapes resilience. And that's my view. I'm not sure if it's the same for other First Nations people. I'll address this in terms of, I guess, in a more personal sense, as you're asking, but just by continuing to show up in a caring way, knowing that you've had impacts of trauma and other things that haven't been great for you, but you can still hold a caring heart. That's resilience. That's going to keep you going forward. Not to say we don't have hurt, not to say at times there may be anger, but I think about more so, if you hear the word, love is stronger than hate. And so just having a caring heart, just continuing to exist in a caring way, building your sense of resilience individually within your family and your community is very much about keeping your resilience there, but in a very good way, and not to be too drawn and taken away from who we essentially are as a people, understanding the importance of collectiveness, and that together we're going to be okay.
There's a lot we can learn, all of us, from that response. Thank you.
Yeah. And then, doing that on the mat when we're in a yoga class, but understanding that transforms with yoga, with that concept of on and off the mat, right? Just doing the same thing. Yeah. And we can build our resilience within a yoga class.
You obviously carry so much wisdom from your journey, and I know that shows up in lots of ways in the different roles that you have in community, but also with everyone that you interact with. Yeah. I'm curious about, in your journey, what are the useful techniques that, and I'm sure it's evolved over time, but what are the things that are your go-to when you're seeking that connection?
Look, I care. I truly care. I'm not perfect, and I show times when I'm not. It would seem like I'm not caring, but that's an internal thing within inside of me. I just care. I care that I just hope everyone's going to be okay in life. And I think that just takes me forward in just being able to care. Yoga has helped me a lot in terms of, and particularly trauma-informed yoga. Because as I said, I think sometimes when I step outside of my community, this is when I do question myself a little bit. In my community, I feel safe, I feel connected, I feel grounded. So when I get outside of my community, I can sometimes question, not so much question myself. I feel that there can be judgments and misunderstandings. And so allowing myself to just be myself, understand that other people's judgments do not impact who I am. And if I could just stay grounded and stay myself, I feel as though that radiates onto other people. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I just am very more mindful of what company I'll be around. And I want to stay balanced. I'm also Capricorn, so I like to stay grounded. I like to stay solid. I like stability, but I understand we live in the impermanence of, things change. But I like solid foundations. So, and I like to build with people, and I don't know, I like to relate to people. I understand that I have a deeper relationship with my children. I have a deeper relationship with my grandchildren. I understand that with my friendships, with my community. But I'm also someone who looks at anybody, even someone who's really angry, someone who could appear to be all about themselves, but I'm trying to understand, why are they all about themselves? Why do they have this need to possess control? Why do they have this need for authority? Why? And I also think because there's something deeper inside of them that's missing, because I feel there's just something inside of them, and I become understanding. Like, I have to accept people for who they are, and I do that. And I'm not going to impart anything too negative onto that. Just acceptance. Yeah. And maybe just smile at people. I feel as though I'm smiling more. Because I just feel as though there's things about me that I carry that I could give to somebody else, a simple gift of smiling. I think that makes sense.
It's beautiful, Jacqui. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I know that you're not only sharing in your own community. I know that you've been sharing both yoga techniques but also First Nations practices much more widely than that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Look, that's just a beautiful opportunity again. As I said, I'm a person who likes to relate. I like to be open. I like to be sharing. And then when I've looked at this, yoga on country and yoga walks on country that I'm doing are drawing in more non-Indigenous people than Indigenous people. And so it's a really beautiful opportunity for me to just relate, welcome people in country. A lot of what I'm teaching, pardon me, my yoga walks on country and my yoga on country are on my traditional custodian lands. So it's like I'm opening up the space, I'm welcoming people in, inviting them to sit and connect with country. And again, just going back to this relationships with self, people and country, really just inviting them to sit and accept themselves in the authentic sense of who they are in that moment. I just really like to sort of share that we don't have to be, if we could just let go of, I need to be at work at 9 o'clock. Oh, I'm the CEO. If we just let go of all of these external identities that we have, and in the way that we exist in the modern world, and just sit and come back to self, whether that be through breath work, noticing that you're always upheld and connected and supported by Mother Earth. That's a given. You can feel her. We're being held up by her now, Danielle. Right? Just getting us to go back to there, I just think that's a really strong connection to have. And then that we're sitting there collectively in that sense. And I also, just as I said, we've had these practices for over 65,000 years, and they're now known in the modern world. So just as mindfulness, as meditation, our way of living was very somatic. So we had that embodied practice. And I think in the West, we tend to get disconnected and we become outside of ourselves of, I'm a title, I'm a CEO, I'm this. Well, I'm not seeing you like that when you come to my practice. I'm seeing you as a person that I can connect to. We can relate to each other. Let's just sit on country and be who we are in the moment. So just really grounding it into connecting and understanding again that interconnectedness and, the ocean, the trees, the plants, we're connected to all living things and that interconnection. And sometimes it's just in the moment when we're doing the practice, if a nice cool breeze comes along, I'm going to go, let's just notice that beautiful breeze. Have you noticed how it's feeling on your cheek as it blows? And then sort of just to get them to understand, here's your connection. You are connected. You don't necessarily have to see things to know you are connected. You can feel something. So just seeing how it goes, and it's and it's also an opportunity for me to talk about truth telling too. And I do acknowledge the country we're on, and that it is still known as Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. And I present it in that way. And I never ever say, this is how it is. I say, here I'm sitting in front of you as a sovereign First Nations woman, a traditional custodians of the lands we're on, and that I know this land as. And I also say, I'm inviting you to be open and curious to knowing this. So just having truth-telling. I just feel as though as I go along, there's so much more to come. There's so many social justice aspects that can be brought into my practice as well. But just starting off, and it's just been 3 years, so I just feel as though I've got a little bit more way to go. And we just recently did a little bit, and my pronunciations of the yamas and the nimyamas isn't so great, but we talked about the yama of non-possessiveness and non-greed was my last yoga and country practice. And I said, First Nations people understood you couldn't be greedy. You can't possess and own and use something for your own individual benefit because it affects the whole, the collective. And so we explored that. And I also said, we've got Dreamtime stories that talk about, there's a story about Titalika, the greedy frog. But story is to share about, if you are greedy, this is what can happen. But with that Dreamtime story, all the other animals thought because Titalika drank all of the water, right? So I understand as human, we all possess at times a desire to want more. We do. And so I always come back to that commonality as human beings. We all have that. So Titalika drank all of the water. And to not go into it too much, but the way the other animals dealt with the greed was, how do we get the water outside of Titalika? And they wanted to use humour. So they had to go through humorous strategies to try and make the frog laugh. And in order to laugh, all of the water would come back out and be returned to the lands. So just sharing our concepts, but as I said, because although we had people who probably at times wanted more than what was needed, we understood we had to maintain that equilibrium. Yeah, so all evolving. Let's see what happens. And then I used the yamas and ninyamas. And so when we sat on country, also did the internal reflections of, can we feel content without wanting more? So I'm just really enjoying what I'm doing. Yeah.
That's so beautiful, Jacqui. Thank you so much for sharing all of the wisdom today from your very integrated journey. It's so appreciated.
And we just have, we have terms like country heals. And so, when we feel like, as you said, we're being trauma informed, we understand, because I'm fortunate enough to know, Indigenous psychologists, Indigenous social workers, Indigenous mental health workers, Indigenous solicitors. But regardless of our title, right, regardless of that, we know that going back to country can help us heal, can help alleviate some of the symptoms of trauma. At times maybe being in our head and remunerating on negative thoughts. Have you been back to country, or did you go out to the ocean? And, just being present, because we were very, very present as a people to understand how the universe worked, how the seasons changed, how to read the stars. Where did we go? What directions were we going to be? And we also understood the impermanence of life. And it's always changing. So we might set up in one particular area of our life because it's summer and we want to be around the ocean. But we knew as the colder weathers come along, where would we go next? And where were the food sources? So we also understood the impermanence of life. But also understanding, just be there where you are, having just what we need and nothing more was going to help maintain a continuation of life cycles.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. I could talk to you for hours and hours and really enjoy soaking up all of the wisdom from everything that you say. We really appreciate your time and sharing all of that with us.
It's been an absolute pleasure being here, Danielle. And as I said, we don't see life as linear. We see it as we go in circles. And we're always wanting to come back. As I said, my yoga journey as a yoga teacher started we're saying 3 years now, so it's 2022, wasn't it? When I walked through those doors, and that was beautiful in that I was learning yoga on one of my custodial lands there in Bondi, and I knew that I would continue to have my connection with you, Danielle. And again, we understand that we don't need to be physically together or physically around each other to maintain a relationship. So an absolute pleasure. And a lot of the times when I am teaching my yoga, I refer back to those beautiful days, my beginning days of learning to be a yoga teacher with the Yoga Impact Charity. And as I said, absolutely drawn to the idea of trauma-informed yoga, understanding the importance of that, understanding my community is very much driven around trauma-informed practices, principles, philosophies in what we've experienced. So absolutely love being here, having a yarn with you.
There's so much that I and every member of our community draw from interactions with you still to this day as well. So thank you so much, Jacqui.
Thank you.